20 states in America have cut reoffending by up to 50% because they send those on probation back to jail for a day or two if they break the conditions of their rehabilitation, such as not turning up at a drug treatment program or turning up late for community work. Well, the think tank, the Centre for Social Justice, wants to see if the same approach would work here. Keith Humphreys, a professor for mental health policy from Stanford University, explained how the system worked in part of the United States.
In the state of Hawaii, the typical offender is using a drug called methamphetamine. In probation, judges will randomly assign people different days to come in for a drug test. And if that test turns out to be positive, they will have a trial, not in a month, but they'll have it that actual afternoon. And the judge will say, up front, we agreed you weren't going to use drugs. You are using drugs, and so I'm going to send you to a cell for the next 2 days. People on that swift and certain probation used about half as many drugs, and also they were about a third as less likely to end up in prison, meaning return back for a long sentence.
Well, Edward Boyd is Deputy Policy Director at the Centre for Social Justice, which seeks to address poverty and its causes. And the economist Vicky Price is the author of Prisonomics. She was sent to prison for 8 weeks for perverting the course of justice after taking her husband's speeding points. And both are with me here in the studio. Good morning to you both.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Now, Edward Boyd, just explain how you would see this working here.
Well, we'd see this working here by introducing 3 principles, making sure that the most prolific offenders receive swift, certain and fair sanctions every time that they breach. And so if an offender, say, fails drug tests, doesn't turn up to unpaid work, they would see themselves in front of a judge within 24 hours, and if the guilt is proven, they would be sent for a short, sharp shock of, say, 1 or 2 days in a jail cell before returning immediately back to their order in the community to carry on their punishment and their rehabilitation, to make sure that they are still addressing the root causes of why they were reoffending in the first place.
OK, so what's different from now is that it's much faster, and what you go immediately back to prison, but possibly not for so long. Is that the...
Absolutely. And the current approach, it will generally be maybe around a month if you're done for a breach before you end up before the court. And our research into this has also shown that many things that people could be breached for, they're not. There's a lot of discretion that probation officers have, and it's in many cases used wisely, but also liberally. We've heard from, for example, one drug offender who was given a rehabilitation course to address some serious Class A drug problems, and he tested positive for drugs around 50 times in one order, and never once was he sent back to court for resentencing. And it stops us from incentivising people who quite often want to get clean, want to change their lives, from doing so, and we end up with more crime as a result.
Vicky Price, can you see this sort of system working to cut what is a very bad reoffending rate?
I think anything that cuts reoffending rate needs to be looked at quite carefully. There's no doubt about that. We want less crime generally. What worries me a little bit about this is the breach and the way that it happens, because, of course, women in particular may be missing one part of whatever the community sentencing may have required them to do. Because of children, because of pressures, because of having gone back to a very difficult environment. And what they really need is help. They don't need to be sent to prison. They need to get a little bit more advice and support. And of course, we've got to remember that all those offences that we're talking about were deemed not to require a prison sentence to begin with. And there you are, in fact, sending them to prison, even for a short period of time, if they've breached one of those conditions. And, of course, what do you do next? The next time, of course, you do a similar test, then you send them to prison, I presume. There isn't any other choice if they have already been and they have not been reformed, because only a certain percentage of them end up possibly not reoffending. So we just have to watch that we don't end up with more people in prison at a time when we actually should be reducing them than what perhaps it is that's going on right now.
And Edward Boyd, the examples from the States, 20 states, all different models. I mean, did they look at those sort of situations where you're talking about, not least women, and the particular concerns that they may have?
Yeah, well, absolutely. And Vicky and I think our listeners would be pleased to hear that one of the things that drove this programme in the States was to actually reduce the overall time people spent in prison. The Hawaii project we heard about earlier, on average, reduced the time somebody would spend in prison by 48 days. Because what it did is it made sure that those sort of sharp shocks of just 1 or 2 days in prisons actually stopped people from reoffending. And it reduced the number of people in prison because fewer people are reoffending, fewer people committing crime, there's less need for people to be in prison as a result. And what we're calling for in the UK, it's not for every offender. We're calling it to be piloted because our criminal justice system is very different from the American one. We need to make it work here. And to be piloted for those prolific offenders who are going on breaching time and time again. Just being very honest, the majority of them are male, but some of them will be female. And I think what's important, if they've got kids, if they've got families, actually, for their sake, for their family's sake, making sure that you can reduce reoffending is what's best for them.
Vicky Price, what are your thoughts on that? I mean, could that removal of the discretion that a probation officer has?
Well, the probation officer has already had the discretion reduced quite significantly. So, in fact, rules have tightened quite considerably, and one of the reasons why we have more people in prison is because of that. They're being sent in after they've done a breach of their sentencing, and that needs to be watched. But, of course, any experiment needs to be looked at really, really carefully. There's no doubt about that. So we can't dismiss it out of hand. But nevertheless, I think what people need is a lot of support to get off their drug habits. That's really what is required. Community sentencing generally, first of all, is cheaper. Second, the reoffending rate is no worse. In fact, in many cases, is better than prisons. And the third thing we need to bear in mind is that how people will be helped is by being properly educated and getting jobs. And that's the sort of support that they need. And that reduces reoffending rate and crime more generally much more substantially than anything else you do.
Vicky Price, Edward Boyd, thank you both.
Thank you.
And we'll